Non-fiction, science fiction, horror, fantasy, crime, LGBT, thriller.
You have now entered the House of Mystery with your hosts, Eric Shapiro, David North Martino, John Copenhaver, and Al Warren.
Heard on KCAA 106.5 FM Los Angeles,
102.3 FM Riverside,
and 105.0 AM Palm Springs.
You're back on the House of History with Al Warren and Kemp Thompson on KKNW 1150 AM, Seattle. How are you doing today, Keb?
It has been a great day. Real good day.
You're too happy too many times. I just got to calm down.
It's a great life.
Yeah, so you're dog sitting. Wonderful.
Well, Mama just got home and just took the dog, so we're good to go.
Oh, good. So no barking, except for yourself.
Nope. Well, yeah, every once in a while.
Okay. Well, today we've got another great guest. We've been really lucking out here, and I'm thrilled to have him. And we'll be talking about his new book, and it's the Horsemen of the Apocalypse. And he wrote it with a couple of other people that we've had on the show, Robert Kennedy Jr. and David Talbot. Mm-hmm. Now we have Dick Russell. So thank you for taking the time today, Dick.
Thanks very much. Good to be with you guys.
So, wow, you've got quite the book lineup. I love them all. And you've worked with people that we've had on, even Jesse Ventura. What made you do this one, like the Horsemen of the Apocalypse? What made you go and do this book in particular?
Well, I've been an environmentalist and very concerned about what's going on with our environment for a long time. I've written 2 natural history books, one on a fight to save a fish, the Atlantic striped bass, that I was involved in very heavily back in the 80s because I'm a summer fisherman, and then a book called Eye of the Whale about the migration of the gray whales, the friendly gray whales in Baja, Mexico's Baja Peninsula, that were threatened by an industrial salt works back in the early 2000s, 99, and so I ended up following the migration of these whales and telling the story of all the threats to them as well as their majesty and beauty. And I've written about climate change in the past. I was writing about it actually back when it was just called global warming back in 1989. So I'm familiar with the subject, and, I just came to feel that it was urgent to get something new out that would put a face on the guys who are most responsible for the situation that we're facing, where our planet our civilization really is in jeopardy unless we make some big changes and make them fast.
Yeah, and I have a house in Canada, and I go up there a lot. I just know that listening to the news and to the science and to the government up there and anywhere else I'm in the world, it's sort of a done deal. They talk about the issues that we have from global changes and climate, and everybody sort of just does that. But when in the U.S., it's a totally political deal here. There's just no science. It's all politics,
Yeah.
How do we make people in the U.S. realize this, like what the rest of the world is talking about? And it's not like this. There seems to be a big conspiracy thought that there's some agenda that it's all about money and politics, but there has to be. There's much more to it.
Oh, there's a lot more to it, of course, and people everywhere are really starting to see the effects of it. The hurricanes are stronger, the tornadoes in our country, and pretty soon we're going to be looking at a situation where our coast, and a lot of people live along the coast in this country, are going to be really jeopardized by massive sea level rise, and people are going to have to move inland or lose billions of dollars actually, and so people are starting to see it, and I think many people in the U.S. The majority of people do believe that climate change is a major problem, but yet a lot of people too voted for Donald Trump, and And now he's in power, and he's installed, we can talk about this further, but, billionaires right across the spectrum, and people like Scott Pruitt at EPA who don't believe that climate change is even real, and Trump has called it a hoax perpetrated by the Chinese. So, the people running this country right now are gonna turn back the clock to way before the majority of scientists said, hey, this is a real threat, and we got to do something about it. I think you're seeing a lot more people, though, take to the streets. I mean, I took part in the big climate march here in L.A. at the end of March, and thousands of people marched toward the Tesoro oil refinery, which is going to merge with BP and create tons more fossil fuels, bring them out of the ground, and add tons more greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. So, and all over the country. I mean, in Washington D.C., there were hundreds of thousands of people everywhere. So, the one thing that the Trump administration is doing is stirring people into action, I think, in a way that they didn't feel they had to when when Obama was in power and put in the Clean Power Plan and all of that. So, I'm not completely depressed about the situation, because I think citizens are getting more active than they were.
Yeah, but I'm not sure what we can do in it other than that, because in a case like this where you've got the, Tillerson in as Secretary of State and stuff, when you've got someone that's so involved in oil, they're not it's against their interests. So it is what it is. I just say I wouldn't see him doing anything different, because why would he?
Exactly. I mean, Tillerson was the CEO of Exxon Mobil, for a long, long time. He's been with the company for more than, I think 20, 30 years. So, and he's a guy who was running this company along with his predecessor, Lee Raymond, when Exxon's own scientists were looking into the situation and warning the bosses that, civilization was facing a huge crisis from what they had discovered about how quickly the planet was heating up, and these changes were happening. So Exxon covered this up for years and years, while at the same time they were funding all these climate denial groups, these so-called nonprofits and shady scientists who were willing for a buck to say that this wasn't happening, whereas 90-some% of the scientists in the world are saying it is, and we got to do something about it quickly. So now you got Tillerson. I was shocked, actually, that Trump went so far as to name this, initially shocked, this big oil man as Secretary of State. But then again, you got to wonder about certain things like the oil deals with the Russians that are maybe playing into what we're seeing now with this scandal that could sink the Trump administration. We'll have to see.
Yeah. Sure leads to a lot of questions. I just don't know. So what's the direction here? And why do people we have leaders or people in Senate like Mitch McConnell or Inhofe and stuff, and now they're getting contributions from oil and coal.
Yeah.
So how is it that they're going to ever do anything different?
Well, they're not. I mean, those guys aren't. The fact is, we got to get rid of those kind of guys, and people got to go to the polls and vote, and the education has got to get much stronger about what's going on and what we're facing. So but they're not going to change. I mean, they're fully supported by these fossil fuel interests, and it's we're talking billions of dollars and people staying in power. So. As long as they're in there, forget it.
Yeah. Well, and so what about the conspiracies on the side saying that climate change is just a
natural phenomena?
That, or just, and there's a whole conspiracy with the Alex Jones group saying that it's about money and it's it's fake, right? Here's that term, fake news. It's not real.
Yeah.
And that they've created it just to make billions of dollars in green energy.
This is just crap. I mean, there's just no way that this can be true. If you look around, I mean, only today there's a story out that the Arctic sea ice is melting a month earlier than it was supposed than generally has, because This is the warmest winter that the Arctic has seen ever. 16 of the last 17 years, we've had record-setting temperatures all over the globe. The Antarctic, the ice sheets there are melting, which means that the Thwaites Glacier, for example, which is huge, is likely to be melting soon as well in a major way. Whereas sea level rise could just escalate dramatically almost overnight. I mean, we could see sea level rise, it's been predicted now, between 10 and 13 feet by the beginning of the next century, or even much sooner than that. So maybe that's what it's going to take for people to see that, but then we're at a point of no return, really. And so, oceans are rising more than they have since the last ice age. So anybody who thinks this is a natural phenomenon, when you're seeing things that have not happened for literally, thousands or even millions of years in some cases, they just got their head in the sand.
So now people are not scientists. What's the best sort of way of explaining this sort of thing to people that, because the average person isn't a scientist. So they watch the news, they hear stuff. What would be the best way to say to someone or explain to someone what's happening around them and how it is perhaps some sort of global warming or climate change or something? Like, what's the best way to explain it, do you think?
Well, I don't know. The science is I don't know if most people can grasp science, and I don't necessarily grasp it all that well myself, but, the levels of the carbon dioxide that's being put into the atmosphere because of the consumption of fossil fuels, and also the methane gases that are being released from melting of permafrost, for one, which is escalating tremendously, and from natural gas, and also from livestock, the tremendous amounts of livestock that we have in this country, creating methane, which is a more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So, it rises into the atmosphere, and our planet begins to heat up because the carbon dioxide gets trapped there, and so that's the basic science 101, I guess. But really, people just have to look around and say, gee, did we have this kind of these kind of hurricanes and wildfires before? I mean, is this just a natural cycle because there's more people or something? And what about the spread of insects that we didn't have before, like the Zika virus that only thrives in hot climates that's coming more and more into this country? And it's just people have got to think beyond today and got to think about the kids and their grandkids and realize that even though we, the older generation, may not live to see the worst effects of this, we won't, that we're putting the future generations in just terrible jeopardy, and we want to take that to our graves? I don't think so.
Well, Dick, can you kind of see where people will come from the angle of conspiracy, though, when you've got Al Gore out there, pitching these carbon credits?
Yeah, well, for one thing, the oil companies and the fossil fuel industry has been receiving far bigger subsidies for many, many years, millions and millions of dollars, than are now going to alternative energy companies, in solar and wind. Carbon credits are not really going to do it. You can't really make incremental steps at this point. What we need is somebody in there in government who is going to, we can't stop burning fossil fuels overnight. I'm not a Luddite. I'm not somebody who's completely unrealistic about this. But we've got to get some kind of Marshall Plan style something in place where we can move toward renewable energy much faster than we are. And the fact is that all over the country, a lot of cities have plans to do this, and they've set target dates. And, by 2025, 2030, that they're going to be using all renewable sources. And what the heck's wrong with that? I mean, it's cheaper. We can get energy from the sun. We can get energy from wind and geothermal. And, that our electric bills are going to be lower. It's really a win-win all the way around.
Well, I agree. I mean, it would be great if renewable energy was viable, and people are trying it, and there is a lot of money being poured into it, but it does not seem to produce as promised.
Well, I don't think that's true. I mean, solar energy, solar jobs now in that industry outnumber coal and oil and gas combined. So, you know, what you have is situations. I went to Kansas. I grew up in Kansas, actually, for part of my life, and went to the University of Kansas. And so I hadn't been back too much in recent years, and I went back to look into the Koch brothers and their empire, which is based in Wichita. And what I found was that, you know, they had done, wind energy was taking off in Kansas. I mean, under the Clean Power Plan, they were more than meeting it because Kansas has a lot of wind. So does Texas. So does Nebraska. I mean, Texas is the number one wind power state in the country now, and they're finding it very profitable. And what the Koch brothers did was go, you know, basically pay candidates to, you know, to defeat them in the state legislature, defeat the ones that were supporting all the wind credits. So they didn't gut it. I mean, there is still wind energy in Kansas, but it's going a lot slower than it did before. And I couldn't really figure it out because here you got these guys, the Koch brothers, who are the biggest, you know, private oil company in the world. A lot of other things they're involved in too, and the richest two men in the world, actually, worth $48 billion apiece, Charles and David Koch. And I mean, wind energy is not cutting into their profits really. It's a weird mindset. It's almost like a death wish of some kind. So I don't know. Did I answer your question? Kind of went off.
Kind of. You know, like let's look at the scandal that Solera had.
Yeah.
I mean,
Solyndra,
that, you know, what's that?
It's called Solyndra, I think. Yeah.
Yes, I apologize.
It's okay.
You know, that was hopeful. You know, I had hope for that, and then that just fell apart. And people are like, wait a minute, you know, who's really benefiting from this?
Well, you know, I don't know a whole lot about that particular company and what happened. I know that they did, you know, there's a lot of federal government money went into that company, and then it didn't make it. But that's not the rule. I mean, you know, I think it's an exception. And what you're seeing really is, I mean, even in coal country now, I read the other day that there's a lot of jobs that are being created in the solar industry that are helping put some of the coal miners back to work. And so, you know, I think these things are seized upon as a way to you know, try to continue to do business as usual. And so I just think it's, you know, that the seizing upon them is more of a conspiracy than anything.
I see that in certain countries too, like Germany, they've been able to pull off solar power quite well.
Oh yeah, I mean, Europe's way ahead of the United States. I mean, Germany is I think close to 50% renewable energy right now, and you know, and it's no wonder. I mean, Trump goes over there over the weekend for the G7 summit meeting this past weekend, and I saw that the Chancellor Angela Merkel said today, you know, wow, I think we're just going to have to go our own way, because he wouldn't even agree to. I mean, 195 countries have signed on to a pact with, you know, to do what they could to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, and the U.S. is part of that. And it doesn't go as far as it needs to, actually. I mean, the Clean Power Plan in this country, which the Trump administration now wants to gut completely, you know, is aimed at cutting the emissions from our electrical grid pretty substantially, but not totally, you know, from fossil fuels by 2030. And so, you know, the European countries were outraged that Trump wouldn't even, you know, agree to stick with the G7 agreement that they had on climate, and is talking about this week pulling out of these international accord that was signed in Paris. So, I mean, that really, you know, in terms of diplomacy, no matter how you look at it, that's really a dumb move among many. But anyway,
it's kind of it's kind of like holding on to the old times, the old ways, and it's
sure.
really time to kind of advance, I think, you know. But
well, I certainly think we better. Yeah. I mean, look, you know, there's so many studies that have been done, and if you want to talk about kids around the world, UNICEF, I think, came out with a study that 25 million more children will be malnourished by 2030, and 100 million will be facing food insecurity because of all the displacement, millions of people from the increased, floods and other situations in the third world, so-called. And, more tthan 1 billion people are going to be at risk from rising sea levels and floods. And so we're talking about the future, and we're going to look back in another 20 years, and if we don't do something and regret it deeply, as far as our kids certainly will.
Yeah. It's going to be real hard to go up against something like the Koch brothers with their wealth.
Yeah.
I see that as a problem because they can market what they want constantly.
They can, and in fact, if you look at the presidential campaign, they did not support Trump. They seemed like they were distancing themselves from him, but the guy that they had that ended up getting in there as vice president was Pence, and Pence was a Koch brothers guy. So once Trump took over, then you see the Koch brothers' influence, because Mike Pompeo, who was basically the congressman that they installed in Wichita, and who was busy doing everything he could to stop renewable energy in Washington, D.C., and suddenly this guy with no experience really is running the CIA. That's pretty scary. And then you got Pruitt, who was funded by the Koch brothers, along with Harold Hamm, who I profile in the book. He's the big fracker in Oklahoma. We can talk about him if you want. And that Pruitt was funded by the Kochs, his campaigns, and by Hamm. And suddenly you got a guy running the EPA who was determined when he was Attorney General of Oklahoma to sabotage the EPA. I mean, he's the one who got all these state attorneys general all over the U.S. to mount a lawsuit against the Clean Power Plan that the EPA is charged with implementing. And now this guy's running it. I mean, talk about conspiracy. It scares me.
Yeah, it kind of doesn't make sense. It's crazy, actually.
Yeah, I was for it before I was against it.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
Yeah.
And, I mean, you got irony there. I mean, it's just not even an irony, but one of the Koch brothers, David, he was on the board of the Smithsonian in D.C., and they even named the Hall of Human Origins at the Smithsonian, the David Koch Smithsonian Hall of Human Origins, and they had an exhibit there. I haven't actually seen it, but I've heard about it, where, the solution to the changing climate was, well, if it gets too bad, we're just going to build underground cities, and then people are going to develop short, compact bodies to be able to move around in tight spaces. I mean, if this guy really believes...
What is that? Forced evolution?
Yeah, forced evolution. Exactly. No, it's really kind of boggles the mind.
Yeah, that's just silly.
It is, isn't it?
Yeah.
And so I don't know. But anyway, it's...
You would think people would realize that no matter what party you want to vote for or what you want to be involved in, that people like that are not out for your best interest.
They're out for their own best interest, and that's really all they care about.
Yeah.
And it's an ideology as well as but basically it's greed and wanting to protect the status quo and believing that technology will solve everything and we're going to be okay. And they got their heads lodged as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, it's a nice thing to dream about, but we have to make it happen.
Right, exactly.
And I don't know, the bees are dying. There's just so many effects right now.
Yeah.
Now, fracking. When we get into that's a really a big threat, sort of, to the water supply, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And originally, when fracking began, it was a technique, hydraulic fracturing, that they were going to be able to bring natural gas up out of very deep holes in the ground, and it doesn't release the kind of carbon emissions that oil does or coal. So, Obama was behind it. Lots of people were at first. But then it became evident. There was this documentary came out called Gasland a few years ago that showed that all these chemicals that they were pumping into these wells were contaminating the groundwater, and in fact, in certain areas, you had people turning on their faucets, and fire was coming out of the faucet. I mean, you can see this in the documentary by Josh Fox. It's quite a show. And then what you have happening in Oklahoma, where fracking really took off, and thanks to Harold Hamm, who made billions off of this new technology and discovered the Bakken field in the shale field in North Dakota, made a fortune off of that. And then what began to happen in Oklahoma is that more and more earthquakes started to be triggered, and this was a result of the disposal of wastewater going into these disposal wells and seeping down in there and fracturing the geologic layers that were already pretty fragile. So Oklahoma now has more earthquakes than any other place in the country, and they've been getting more and more powerful, up to 5.6 at one point, I think they had. So you had this going on, and at the same time, you have a situation where Ham sits on the board of the University of Oklahoma. A lot of these big oil and gas guys are on the boards of these universities there. And so Ham sat down with the president of the university, David Boren, who used to be a U.S. senator, and basically, said, hey, your geological survey is showing that our practices are causing this increase in earthquakes. So, I think we got to do something about that. So they basically set out to muzzle the Austin Holland, who was the geologist that was coming up with these very scientific studies. This went on for some years before finally the governor of Oklahoma, Mary Fallin, admitted that, it looks like these practices are causing these earthquakes, and we're going to have to shut down some of these disposal wells. But, by then an awful lot of people have been affected, and so that's another, besides the emissions that are happening, which are more than people thought in terms of methane, you got this contamination and earthquake issue.
Is there any way we could, by stopping doing these things like fracking, that we're going to return to what we were? Do you think it can repair itself, or is there an effect that's permanent now?
No, I don't think it doesn't seem to be permanent. I think once they shut down some of the disposal wells, where you don't continue to have this chemical solutions going in there and fracturing the geological structures, they've seen a decrease in earthquakes in Oklahoma, and certainly they have in other states as well. They have in Kansas, and I think in Iowa, Texas was having more earthquakes also. And so, nature is interesting. I found years ago during this campaign to save the Atlantic striped bass, there were two big threats. One of them was pollution in the Chesapeake Bay, which is where the fish spawned, and the other was overfishing. And so there wasn't a whole lot you could do in the short term about the pollution, but once the fishing pressure was stopped, and it was all along the coast, the fish made the greatest comeback that any fish has ever made. It's now there are millions of striped bass around again, and which supports recreational and commercial industries. And so nature's very resilient if you give it half a chance. Is what
so
I
it can.
Back in the
So it can heal itself.
Yeah, but the climate's a bit of a different situation because, once these gases go up there into the atmosphere, it takes a while for the results to be shown and get worse. And we've triggered so many. Now that there's what's called I don't know, what do you call it, synergistic effects, where the melting of the permafrost in the Arctic is going to release tons more methane that's been buried and therefore contained in the earth for millions of years, really. And so once that layer of permafrost starts to melt and release this methane, then you're increasing exponentially the amount of carbon, not carbon, but the amount of greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere, and that's going to accelerate this whole problem. And the ocean is becoming more acidified, so the fish don't have enough oxygen to breathe. The fish need oxygen, and because it's an acidified layer that's permeating more and more. So we're going to see, a loss of a huge part of our food supply unless we do something. And the coral reefs are starting to die and bleach. And so, these one thing triggers another. And that's the thing that is really scary and that people don't quite see yet, I don't think.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, I guess when I got back to Canada last time from Seattle, that was what was running on the news, I believe. They were showing they were up north, and any time they cut through the snow or the ice, the methane would come out, and they could have a torch, and it would just blow.
Yeah.
It was
so you saw that?
Yeah, it was insane.
Yeah. Yeah.
You don't see that on the news in the U.S. That's not.
No, you
That's
don't.
not on CNN or Fox or anybody. They don't even talk about it. They don't show that. And then you just watch the regular news across the border, and it's the number one story. They're blowing all this fire out of the methane.
Yeah.
It was crazy.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't know what, the news is very obviously daily and sensationally based, and right now really all that's happening is, I was hoping to get the word out more about my new book, and a bunch of media appearances were canceled because the only focus is on Trump and whether he's going to be impeached and what he says every day, and so that's what's happening, and there's nothing to really do about that, but it certainly gives things like climate change short shrift in terms of what they're going to say, except maybe in a quick soundbite. So the emergency is an emergency, but it's not getting out there in the way it needs to be. I don't know what you do about that. Just chip away, I guess.
Well, here's my frustration, and I'll try to be concise here. Like Al said earlier on, I am not a scientist. I only play one on TV.
Right.
and not very well.
Now you've got the science that's out there, and Obama made a big deal about saying, well, the science is established. That greenhouse gases, that we're slowly destroying the planet, and the ice caps are melting. Then you've got this other group over here that is claiming just to be just as scientific, saying, no, this is a natural phenomenon. It happens every so many thousand years. And, you mentioned Gasland, and they're like, well, we have evidence that was faked. That was fraud. So me, as the average Joe, what do I believe? What am I supposed to believe? This was a hot summer, had no snow like we normally do in the winter, yet I've got somebody telling me that's a natural phenomena, and somebody over here telling me that this is a global emergency.
Yeah, well, as I said, the overwhelming majority of science and scientists say, overwhelming meaning like 98%, say that we're in an emergency, and that and cite all kinds of facts to show it. So what people got to realize is that there are these big companies that have their vested interest in continuing to do exactly what they've been doing since the 19th century in some cases. That they're paying people to cast doubt. And so you've got people who get confused. A lot of the public gets confused because, unfortunately, the media also gives as much, if they have somebody on there who says one thing, it makes good press for somebody to say the opposite, and then you get into an argument, and you got the talking heads doing their thing. So, people don't know quite who to believe. But the reality is that almost every legitimate scientist who studied this in the country says one thing, and a handful of people who have a louder voice than they should because they're getting millions of dollars to say it are getting equal time.
Now I'm tracking you. I'm with you so far, Dick. However, I'm being told by trusted sources that, well, those scientists that are saying that the planet's being destroyed, they're paid too, and it's part of their agenda, and it really has nothing to do with climate. It has to do with control.
Well, I just don't buy that for a minute. Then you've got to mistrust thousands of people who are saying one thing and imagine that there's some kind of vast, global scientific conspiracy to make something up that's going to move us into alternative energy. I mean, it just, come on, it just doesn't make any logical sense.
Yeah, I agree, but there's the whole side. I mean, this last election, as well as the whole conspiracy over the last couple of years, has been about the mistrust. Because right now, more than half the country does not trust their own intelligence agencies. So, the FBI, the CIA, Homeland Security, as soon as they come up with any sort of statement, there's this whole half the country that it's fake news, that it's not real, that and then even if they sort of believe it, then they turn around and go, well, I'm not going to believe it until you can prove it. So they don't even trust their own agencies.
Yeah, I know. Well, that's unfortunately the level we've reached, is that there's such a huge mistrust of government in general, and and there's good reason for that. I mean, this is the reality of the country, is that people just don't know who to believe anymore, and our politicians who just take as much money as they can to keep themselves in power have contributed to that. And so is, of course, the Supreme Court decision with Citizens United and making money the thing that rules everything. So, when that's the case, yeah, it's hard to see the forest for the trees. I mean, it's just it's a sad situation. I don't think it's quite half the country. I mean,
well,
Trump didn't get
half the voices.
But, but those voices speak loudly. The Heartland Institute.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But they did it. Look what they did with the tobacco industry for years. I mean, when they were trying to deny that smoking caused cancer. I mean, they used to say, doubt is our product. So if you can cast doubt on the scientific facts, then nothing's going to change. And you got places, these right wing think tanks like Heartland, which is funded by the Koch Brothers, which are now sending these things out because they got tons of money to do it, to public schools all over the country, trying to cast doubt put the children in doubt. Oh well, maybe it's happening and maybe it's not, and that to me is just it's insidious, but that's what's going on.
Yeah. Well, I tend to always try to look at people that I trust in the science itself before making a decision. So, but that's hard to do in this world.
Well, Alex Jones has high-level resources.
Yeah, I don't dismiss everything Alex Jones says, but I think I did his show once, and the guy goes really, quite far in terms of what he's just to sort of make a name for himself.
I'm totally anti-Alex, and Kevin's a little more pro-Alex, but I'm totally. I think he's just the worst showman I've ever seen. He's not even a good actor. So.
But look at this. We're talking about him, aren't we?
Exactly.
Here we go. Right.
We talk about a lot of people, but
he is a showman. Boy, he can get a little crazy sometimes.
Yeah.
He can. Did you see Colbert's great imitation of him one night? Oh, it's amazing.
No, I'm going to look for it now. I'll tell you, because it makes me want to cry on the air. So, I don't know. It's crazy. Listen, keep going. Sorry.
Oh,
yeah,
no.
I was going to just talk for a minute about this. This is sort of a classic example. I do have this chapter in the book on this public relations guy whose son actually has turned against him and come out and called him a monster. But his son's a musician, but he's a public relations wizard, I guess, named Richard Berman. And there was a tape that was made of him with an audience of fossil energy executives a few years ago. It was secretly taped and leaked to the New York Times. And he would say things like, you can either win dirty or lose pretty. You got to think of this as an endless war. And he was saying that the tactics, you should exploit emotions like fear and greed and anger. Anything to diminish the other side's ability to operate. So he said you can't get into people's heads and convince them to do something as easily as you can get into their hearts or into their guts. And so you get there. You want a video to go viral? He said you have kids or animals. I mean, this is the level that it's at. So that's hard to fight. I mean, it's difficult.
Well, absolutely. We've got them saying never let a good tragedy go to waste.
Right. That's right.
So, again, we're back to the trust issue. I don't want to destroy the planet. I have children. I don't litter. I try to recycle. I try to do the reasonable things. And now I'm being told that that's not enough.
Well, it's not enough because the individual actions are not strong enough, unfortunately, because they're just not, to combat what the fossil fuel industry is pouring into the atmosphere. So, it's not that you shouldn't do what you can, because you can, but it's not going to solve the problem until we switch the way we get our energy sources. And you've got what Exxon was doing, for example, for a long time was burying alternative, like fossil fuels. I interviewed this guy about a fellow named Pat Grimes, who used to work for under Tillerson, actually, at Exxon Enterprises before Tillerson ran the company. And this guy was a scientist who had introduced the first fuel cell powered tractor when he was with Alice Chalmers, and he was the first one to explore the possibility of recycling carbon dioxide, recycling it to make fuel. And Exxon was taking out all these patents, and they had this guy working for them. Then they ended up just gutting their research and development department. They just cut the budgets 90%, like Trump wants to do now to the EPA. Not that much, but basically the same kind of thing.
Yeah.
And Exxon, it came out last year that their company scientists, they created early versions of the batteries that are now being used to power electric vehicles, like the Tesla. So they had all this stuff years ago, but they didn't want to get into it because it wasn't where their bottom line was going to, it would affect their bottom line. So, to me, it's more than hypocrisy. I mean, it's really criminal. I mean, they came up with this device to help power electric motors for hybrid cars. Now you got, the Prius out there. I drive a Prius, which is made by Toyota, obviously, but they're the ones that got interested in it but it was the first hybrid gas electric car was come up. Exxon engineers came up with it. Mm-hmm. So, but they didn't want to do it, and now we're paying the price.
Yeah, it's really a tough one because the greed creates inventions, but it goes too far, doesn't it?
What do you mean too far?
Well, it's in things like that where they don't want to change, and so the bottom line becomes the important thing more than the big picture.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah.
Wow, that's just it's a depressing conversation, but needs to be done.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say just something we need to be talking about more, and not so much, the 24-hour Trump news cycle. We just need to be talking about things that are real like this. We
do. And also, there are some hopeful signs. I mean, it's not just completely hopeless and depressing. I mean, you've got one of the things I tried to do in the book, and I would have had more, except I couldn't get a lot of people to talk to me. But I wanted to look at some of the next generation members of fossil fuel families who really don't like what's going on and are trying to make a difference. And the big one along those lines is the Rockefeller family, which that was Standard Oil, and the predecessor of Exxon. And the family still owned a lot of shares in Exxon Mobil. And, they have really been out front, a lot of them. Their Rockefeller Brothers Fund and the Rockefeller Family Fund in trying to get shareholder resolutions passed that will force the company to take climate change into greater consideration. And I interviewed one of the young family members. He's the grandson, actually, of the late David Rockefeller, who passed away recently. And he's out there, he was working hard to develop bioenergy in Jamaica, a big plant there. He's now working on a hemp operation in New York. So he's he's a young guy who's determined to make a difference, and there are others like that too. I interviewed Catherine Lorenz. I profile her in the book, and she's the granddaughter of the man George Mitchell, who started the hydraulic fracturing back. It seemed like a relatively benign thing to do, and he was actually an environmentalist too. But she's running the family foundation now and really pushing hard for wind energy in Texas and elsewhere. She was influenced by her grandfather actually, who wanted to make a difference in the world too. So we're not talking just all evil people. I mean, there are some really good folks out there that are doing everything they can for a more sustainable world for the future.
Mm-hmm. Who do you find, like when you say people wouldn't talk to you, who was it that wouldn't talk to you about to do the book? Who wouldn't be interviewed, or can you say that?
Well, certainly the big moguls themselves wouldn't, and then a lot of the children wouldn't either. They just didn't. I understand that. I mean, they didn't want to be in a position of bashing their own families, and some of them, like Tillerson's kids and the Koch brothers, the son, they're going into the same business. I mean, sort of like Jared Kushner. It's like they're going to stick with it, right? So, but some of them just, even though they're much more progressive, like the daughter of the granddaughter of the H.L. Hunt family, she just didn't want to be in a position to bash her family, I think. So I tried, but there were relatively few that I could interview. Although there's a new organization. I went to this big conference at the United Nations. It's called Nexus, and it's created by and for the children of, quote, inherited wealth. And they are all, and there's hundreds of them, they come together at regional meetings, and there's a climate group in L.A., and they're really talking about how they can use their money, their inheritances, to try to do something different than their parents and grandparents have. So, that's positive stuff, and I'm glad to see it happening and hope there's more of it.
Were there any interviews that surprised you?
Oh, let me think. Well, I interviewed quite a few people in Oklahoma. I went there to profile ham, look into ham, and and I found out that there's been a big crackdown in that state, not just on the geologists, but people who go out and protest. They were getting arrested with very severe charges. That was kind of I wasn't terribly surprised, but I was, felt like the word should get out about that. And then the guy I mentioned, this fellow who knew about Pat Grimes, the Exxon researcher, and learning how Exxon had buried these alternatives for years, that was new information and surprising to me. So those were a couple examples. I tried to get out in the field as much as I could. I was in Texas. I went to Tillerson's ranch, actually. This is before he was Secretary of State. And I still remember, I pulled up. He's got a big, big horse ranch there outside of Dallas, a little town called Bartonville. And you couldn't get into the ranch, obviously, but I looked over and I saw this metal globe, and that was, a carved globe sitting outside the fence around his ranch. And it had all these pieces cut out of it. It was really kind of amazing, as if somebody had taken and carved up the world according to Tillerson's, game plan. And it was so symbolic. I took a picture of it. I didn't put pictures in the book, but, and then I noticed that. So I took a picture and I drove off, and when I came back by the ranch later, there was, of course, a security truck out there to make sure that nobody else like me would show up and notice this globe. So, that kind of thing.
They're coming to get you now. Yeah.
Yeah.
You've seen too much.
Yeah.
That's it. But, and I went to St. Louis. I went to research the Peabody Energy Company there and their CEO and interviewed people in coal country who have just been had so many problems with pollution. And the big thing that surprised me there, the CEO is a guy named Greg Boyce, and I had no idea. But again, the hypocrisy of it all. They started this energy poverty campaign, which also Exxon has gotten into and other companies since. But they were saying that coal was going to really be a huge factor in bringing people in Africa and India and Asia out of poverty, and they even paid this young woman from China who had connections to the industry to talk about what coal had done for her family, but not a single mention, of course, that 1/3 of all the carbon emissions come from coal, about 11 billion tons a year, and I got into the fact that this energy poverty campaign was another way to deflect attention from the real problem.
Yeah, that's the whole market right now is about creating attention with something that's really not the subject.
Right.
Yeah. Well,
distraction.
Yeah. Now this has been a great conversation. We're coming to the end of the hour. I've really enjoyed it, and we'd love to have you back because we do a lot of JFK and on the trail of JFK assassins and the man who knew too much, or 2 books you've done that I'd really like to spend a show talking about. We've had everybody from Roger Stone to Vince Palomara, you name it, and we'd love to have you on as well in the future date.
Well, I'd be glad to do that at some point. I spent many, many years of my life researching the Kennedy assassination, and I think probably came up with more new material about it than any other journalist in this country. And
do you have thoughts? Have you seen the Burl Bear, the History Channel thing that they're doing right now with Oswald? And have you seen any of them yet?
I have not seen that. I've heard a little about it, and I would like to see it. And I think what they're trying to do is point the finger in the wrong direction at Cuba and the Soviet Union. And I'm not saying there wasn't a cleverly designed plan by the people who really pulled off the assassination to make it look that way. And of course, you had Oswald, who'd been in Russia for 2.5 years and wanting to get into Cuba. If he actually didn't get into Cuba, I think he might have. So they were definitely trying to make it look. A group of people were trying to make it look like those folks had done it. And but everything I've seen indicates the opposite. That it was a right-wing cabal, not a huge one, but definitely people who were out for their own interests to get rid of Kennedy and Castro at the same time.
Now, it's my understanding that it was Ted Cruz's father.
Right, I saw that.
Well,
I never heard that one, and I looked into the Cuban exile community quite a bit. So, anyway, I was
Ted
there.
Cruz's father, and Ted Cruz was the Zodiac. So come on, his family,
right.
they were busy. Right. They had lots to do. Wow.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, and it was just Kennedy. It would have been his 100th birthday. That's just an amazing. I didn't really.
I know.
Yeah. So.
Yeah. Well.
Yeah.
What a difference.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. I mean, but that was a different world, and had Kennedy not been president, I think at that time, had Nixon been in there instead, we might not be talking today, because I think the Cuban Missile Crisis could have well resulted in an apocalyptic end game for civilization. So. Yeah. I think he would, and then of course one of the big reasons that he was assassinated was that he did agree to take our missiles out of Turkey and not to invade Cuba, and there were people in power that didn't like that.
Yeah, and I miss our radical liberals of those days in the 70s, in the 60s.
Oh yeah, I mean.
Well, we need some strong liberals out there.
We do need them. I mean, look what they were able to do. That even the ones in Congress, like Senator Frank Church and Senator Richard Schweiker. I mean, these guys were willing to look into the CIA and who really killed Kennedy and put things on the record that we otherwise would never know about. I mean, who would know about the MK Ultra program, where the CIA was out to control human behavior with all these experiments in hypnosis and LSD and all that in the 50s. We wouldn't know any of that if we hadn't had the kind of, guts thrown.
And still do.
Yeah, and we need the Black Panthers back, man.
Oh, stop. Oh, stop.
I see we're going to get into a big argument.
Yeah, I like doing that. Well, again, this has been great. And our guest today has been Dick Russell from his new book, The Horseman.
To find out more about our show, guests, or to listen to past shows from our archive, please go to www.houseofmysteryradio.com.
Show's over for now.
Was it as good for you as it was for me?
Well, good night.
This has been a production of Something Weird Media.
I'll be back.